This is the United States History 202, Presentation 19, Civil Rights 1865 to the present. So what we're going to do in this particular presentation is talk about, we're actually going to backtrack and talk about some things, an area we've already addressed in the course, 1865, so there'll be a review. And we'll get up to the 20th century, which is often considered the Civil Rights era. We'll talk about some of the major trends in that period of time, legislation and other things that are going on, both at the federal level and also at the state level too in some cases. So first and foremost, I have to define a couple of things here. The first definition is de facto segregation. This is segregation that exists in fact, possibly illegally, and we'll address that at the end of the course, at the end of this presentation. We'll talk about, does segregation still exist and does it matter? When I say does it matter, I don't mean as a moral decision, but do Americans really care? Because if you look at segregation in the United States today, a lot of it is what would be called separation or self-segregation or self-separation. Freedom of association is essentially what that is. So we'll talk about it at the end of the class, and I'll show you a map that outlines that. De jure segregation is segregation by law or legal segregation. So you had legal segregation in the United States in the late 19th century until about the middle of the 20th century. And the civil rights movement will eventually target both elements of segregation, at least in the 50s and 60s, though I would suggest that de facto segregation is not as important as de jure segregation was in the modern era. Now, early civil rights legislation, we had the Civil War amendments to the Constitution. We already talked about the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which granted former slave citizenship of the United States. And basically, the point of the 14th Amendment was allow former slaves to hold property and sue in court. That was it. That was what was considered the privileges and immunities of American citizens at the time. Not what's happened recently with the 14th Amendment, which is incorporation. That is an improper application of the amendment. 15th Amendment granted freedmen the right to vote. So you had slavery abolished. Now slaves could hold property and sue in court, and they were given the right to vote. Men were given the right to vote, not women yet. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was passed by Congress to prohibit segregation in public facilities. The question never was, is segregation legal in private facilities? Everyone thought it was. If you owned a business or an establishment, if you were a business holder or a hotel or something of that nature, you could prohibit certain people from partaking in your business. But as far as taxpayer-supported facilities, courthouses, just take your pick of all. Courthouses were one of the most important things. But then later on, you would have other taxpayer-supported services, bus stations, and things of that nature. The question was whether you could prohibit those. Schools, of course, if you could prohibit segregation in those facilities. This decision, or this legislation, I should say, was ignored and later declared unconstitutional in what are called the Civil Rights cases of 1883. In fact, in 1896, the Supreme Court, in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, ruled that segregation was legal. So I often caution people, when you put all your faith in the Supreme Court, which people tend to do nowadays, well, the Supreme Court is going to say it's constitutional or it's not. The Supreme Court can change its mind. The Supreme Court for years said segregation was legal. It declared civil rights legislation unconstitutional. So it depends on who's on the court, who's on the bench, I should say, as to whether the legislation that you want is going to be declared constitutional or not. And so that's not always a good remedy for particular situations. 1947, Jackie Robinson became the first African-American to play in the Major League Baseball in the modern era, and he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. There were African Americans who played before the modern era, but this is the first in the modern era. And so that was a major milestone because now you had segregation breaking down in modern professional athletics where it existed. So this was used in 1947. We're out of World War II, and that's really an interesting topic. World War II happens. You have American soldiers over in Europe. They're coming across the Holocaust and the situation with Jews there and the Nazi ideology. And so when they came back to the United States, a lot of these soldiers, they had been fighting against supposed oppression and tyranny there. But they looked at the United States and said, well, we have this problem here. What are we doing here? So This is why, post-World War II, you really start seeing a push for civil rights in the United States. World War II really did that. It changed some things in society in America. 1948, President Harry Truman, through Executive Order 9981, orders the desegregation of the United States military. Now, he can do this. It was thought constitutionally because he is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Though the organization of the armed forces actually came down to Congress, if you look at the Constitution. So there was question as to whether Harry Truman could actually desegregate the military on his own, or if he needed congressional approval. Well, he does it anyways. And Truman was like that. Truman abused the executive office. He nationalized steel mills, for example, at one point. So it doesn't matter. I mean, this was considered, the question of the civil rights era is going to be constitutional versus moral. And so generally what happens in the 40s, 50s, and 60s is that the moral argument, what you would often say is the higher law argument, wins out. Whether the actions being taken by the central government are constitutional or not, that doesn't matter. What matters is the moral organization and the moral argument winning out. So you make a very strong case for the moral argument in all these things. As to whether the constitutional argument holds water, that's another question, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, 1954, you have a landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education, and the case basically came down to school desegregation in Kansas, in Topeka, Kansas. Kansas was segregated. They had legal segregation, and so the civil rights leaders decided to make an end-around attack on segregation. If they had attacked segregation somewhere like Mississippi or Alabama or South Carolina or Georgia, they didn't think they would be successful, or they would face too much opposition. So if you go to Kansas and you attack it there, maybe you're going to have more of a chance. Well, Thurgood Marshall is argues for the plaintiffs here against the state law of segregation in Kansas. Thurgood Marshall later became a United States Supreme Court justice. And the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, will strike down school segregation. They said schools should integrate at all deliberate speed, and this is the famous Warren Court. Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, made several decisions, and what they started doing was looking at things in more of a political and moral tone rather than just a constitutional argument. In fact, you could suggest that the justification for the Brown versus Board decision was found nowhere in the Constitution. This was simply a moral decision, not a constitutional decision. And there were some, even in the African American community, who were critical of the decision because they said what you are doing is codifying inferiority in black Americans, because you are saying separate but equal is never equal. So they were saying, look, you're saying that black schools never produce good students. So there were some people who were even upset about this at the time. But the question is, what is all deliberate speed? So this was interpreted differently across the United States. Some people said that was immediately. Some said, well, when we get around to it. So here's a map that shows where segregated schools, de jure segregation was required. You can see in the South. You also have places where you have it's optional, like Kansas or Wyoming, New Mexico, and Arizona. You have states where it's forbidden, Colorado, Idaho, and Washington State out west, and then several states in the Midwest and in the Mid-Atlantic area. But then you have states where there are no legislation. Essentially what happens there, because there's no legislation, you're going to see segregation, even in states where it's forbidden. You're going to see it simply by people moving into different areas of cities. In fact, in Boston, in Massachusetts, you're going to have riots in the 1970s when schools are forced to integrate, because they were not integrated in Massachusetts, even though segregation is forbidden by law. Now, there were some other interesting developments here in the 1950s. In 1955, on the heels of the Brown v. Board of Education decision, Rosa Parks is going to become the standard bearer for a time of the civil rights movement in the United States. That's because in 1955, she refused to give up her seat to a white customer on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. Now, the way it worked is the buses were segregated, of course, by race, and there was a what they called a colored section and then a white section. And so Rosa Parks was actually sitting in the proper section legally for the time, and several white customers got on the bus, and so now these people had to stand. And so the bus driver went to the situation went to Rosa Parks and addressed the situation and said, you need to move, and she refused. Now, the white customers weren't really making much of a stink about it, but the bus driver was. And so she didn't move. She was arrested, and this started the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. Now, Rosa Parks was a civil rights worker, and she was involved in the civil rights movement in Alabama. There were a couple of interesting things that happened here. The boycott was actually advocated by Martin Luther King. You can see him pictured in the background there, and Rosa Parks, of course, supported that. But there were other black leaders who said, well, look, let's do something different. There was a man named S.B. Fuller who owned a company called Fuller Products. And Fuller Products was a very wealthy company, and most people didn't know that Fuller was black. But it's an amazing story. He started this company with like $50, refused to take any government public assistance, and really made a name for himself. He came down to Alabama and suggested that they just buy the bus company and therefore integrate it. And at that point, that would make a strong statement, because here you have black leaders with money, and therefore they can use the economic muscle. This is what Booker T. Washington was advocating. We already talked about this earlier. They had money, use that economic muscle to show that you can't push them around. But the decision was made to use a boycott instead. Now, in 1956, the Supreme Court in Browder v. Gale desegregated the Montgomery buses, the public transportation system in Montgomery, again, as a moral decision. So this is where you get to these constitutional or moral decisions. Wasn't quite clear the Supreme Court had any jurisdiction here, but they do it anyways. Now, there was a tremendous amount of protests, of course, in Alabama and elsewhere about these segregated buses, and there was actually some violence. Rosa Parks' situation was unique in that there was no violence, but there was some violence on these buses. Some of the bus drivers were attacked. So this wasn't a peaceful situation at all times. And a lot of that is not mentioned when you talk about this particular situation. So the situation was tense. Even though you had nonviolent resistance advocated by people like King and Rosa Parks, you did have people who were engaging in violence, and violence meant violence oftentimes. Now, in 1957, the Little Rock High School will be desegregated. That's because 9 students want to go to Little Rock High School, and of course the city of Little Rock refused. And so Dwight Eisenhower, who was president at the time, sent in the U.S. Airborne to desegregate the school. So there you have the students being marched into the school at gunpoint to protect them. So here the federal government now, the executive branch, has said we're going to enforce the Brown versus Board of Education decision with the military, regardless of what the states say. So the states had started resisting. In fact, they were trying to do this through legal means. And several state attorney generals had filed suit. They were trying to block these things. And the executive branch made a decision that they don't care about that. We're just going to go and enforce the Brown versus Board of Education decision. In 1960, you had the Greensboro sit-in at the Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Again, this is a nonviolent protest of segregation. These particular students decided that they were going to sit at the lunch counter. That was illegal. They would not be served, but yet they took up seats, and the white customers refused to sit there. So this is going to be an economic coercion, nonviolent resistance, where you don't go out and do anything but protest by occupying a space. And so this becomes very popular in the civil rights movement, which worked to their advantage because Americans didn't like seeing violence on the television, because a lot of the times this violence was broadcast back to American living rooms across the country. And here are these people looking for equal access to public facilities, or just equal access in general in American society. They had served in wars and been valuable contributors to American society, and now they want a seat at the table. And so these people are being abused by the government at times, attacked, and this becomes, now it takes a wider swath of America by storm, because people are saying, we need to stop this. You can't shoot water cans at these people and stick dogs on them and beat them up when they're not resisting. There was no resistance here. So it's an ingenious move to use nonviolent resistance because it works. Now, 1961, you get something called the Freedom Rides. These were in response to a Supreme Court decision, Boynton v. Virginia, which said that interstate bus travel, segregated interstate bus travel, was unconstitutional. So what happens is that you have these individuals, white Americans, who will come down to southern bus stations and get on buses in order to force integration of the buses. And they travel from South Carolina initially into Alabama and then later on to Mississippi. Now, this is going to cause some problems. Now, this is John F. Kennedy is president at this point. And in fact, the Kennedy family was encouraging some of this stuff. So were other, civil rights workers in the North. But as one of these buses arrives in Alabama, the patrons of the bus are going to be pulled off, beaten. One bus will be burned. So Bull Connor, who was an Alabama sheriff, is going to be responsible for this stuff. And so again, there are television crews embedded in here, and this stuff gets broadcast all over the United States. John Patterson, who's attached to Phoenix City, he actually was from Phoenix City, he was governor of Alabama at the time, was very upset with the Kennedy administration because Kennedy's response was to try to federalize this particular situation when Patterson insisted he could have it under control. What Patterson wanted to do was use the state police, which he had full control over, to stop the violence. Even though Patterson had a segregationist platform, he has later said that the only way you could get elected in Alabama at the time was to be a segregationist. But he was an ardent segregationist at the time, but he did not necessarily want, and I don't think he really wanted it at all, he didn't want, the biographers have said he didn't want this violence going on because it made Alabama look bad. So Bull Connor was a real problem. Some of the other individuals here who are doing this stuff are a real problem for the governor. And, of course, it's drawing attention in Alabama, what Patterson thought was unwanted attention. And the Kennedy administration is going to make political heyday of it and start using the opportunity to come down and use federal muscle to integrate in Alabama, and also then later in Mississippi. Now, there was resistance to integration at the university level as well. 2 students were killed in Mississippi when the University of Mississippi refused to integrate between 1962 and 1965. You had George Wallace at the University of Alabama in a summer session of 1963 saying that he will not allow these students into the school. Of course, the National Guard would be federalized to enforce integration. Wallace would stand aside. And Wallace is an interesting character. In fact, early in his political career, he was not an ardent segregationist, but he figured out that in order to win, he needed to be a segregationist in the 1950s and 60s. So he's from Eufaula, just down the road from here. So Wallace's political positions changed with the political tide of the state. Southerners began to call this period the Second Reconstruction because the federalization of the National Guard, because of the troops being sent in to enforce the edicts of the Supreme Court. And so this became a very tense period in the South and across the United States. Now, the most famous civil rights leader of the time, of course, is Martin Luther King Jr., whose real name is Michael King. Michael King, not Martin Luther, but Michael King. And Michael King, or Martin Luther King, was instrumental in the process of using nonviolent resistance to draw attention to the civil rights movement in the South. In fact, in 1963, in July of 1963, the very famous March on Washington, D.C., King and several civil rights leaders brought attention to the situation, and King made his very famous I Have a Dream speech there, which was one of the most well-known speeches in world history, not just in the United States, but in world history. In 1965, you had something called the Bloody Sunday event. There was a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, when many people were beaten up, dogs were sicked on people, water cannons were used. And so this, again, highlighted the tension here in Alabama, and the popular opinion was shifting very rapidly in favor of the civil rights movement because of the fact that people did not tolerate and could not countenance people being abused and killed, and you had a bombing of a church in Birmingham. People didn't like this. They didn't like this was not a good move for the anti-civil rights people to use so much violence when their opponents were not using any violence. So this became a black eye on the South, and of course King and the civil rights workers would be elevated to have tremendous support in the United States, and for good reason. When you are nonviolently resisting someone and people are beating you up, nobody's going to support that. The other side, nobody's going to support the attackers. Now, King was also opposed to the Vietnam War, and because he said, what role do black Americans have in this war? We don't have equal rights here. We can't We can't, do the same things that white Americans can. Why should we go bleed and die in Southeast Asia, and for what reason? King also associated with numbers of communists, and I've mentioned this earlier on in the class when we talked about, in Presentation 3, when we talked about black American leaders. A lot of them flirted with communism because of the egalitarian message. That's a very powerful message when you have not had a seat at the table, when you've not had any type of role in government or society. When you start calling for egalitarianism, it resonates. Now, King, of course, was killed by James Earl Ray. At least that's what the official story is in 1968. And the King family to this day, and even people associated with King, would believe that James Earl Ray was set up and that the government was actually involved. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI had been monitoring King for years, and that's who people really believe was behind the assassination of King. Now, he also taped King making some pretty scandalous comments about John F. Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy. And Jackie Kennedy, this just came out recently, hated Martin Luther King because she thought he had made some derogatory statements about her and her husband. And so she really didn't like Martin Luther King. And, of course, the one thing that is not often brought up with King, but maybe one black mark on his record, was that he did plagiarize his dissertation. This is common knowledge. King did philander. He did cheat on his wife quite frequently. So King was not, without his faults. But as a leader of the civil rights movement, he's going to make a tremendous impact on America. And again, that nonviolent resistance, that peaceful resistance, was very important in this movement. And he was the most ardent proponent of it. And it's very hard to do when you're being attacked. And so King was able to use that to his advantage. Now, the President of the United States from 1963 to 1969 was Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson from Texas wanted to ensure that one of his legacies became civil rights. So Johnson advocated the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. The object of both was to end segregation once and for all across the United States in public and also private facilities. So that was the main goal of these two pieces of legislation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was an attempt to enforce the 15th Amendment. This is still a major issue because we've had a Supreme Court decision now saying that it's not really that important anymore, that segregation has virtually disappeared across the South, so the southern states don't have to follow separate rules as the rest of the United States. This is something that the current Justice Department is dealing with. And, of course, it was during the Johnson administration that you had the 24th Amendment to the Constitution ratified, which eliminated poll taxes. And we talked about poll taxes earlier. You could force black Southerners to pay a tax that they couldn't afford so they couldn't vote. Now, race riots. Many violent race riots occurred in the 1960s, but a lot of these were in northern cities. People don't realize that. But racism was not just a southern issue. Many black Americans felt alienated in the North. We talked about that in Presentation 3. But between 1966 and 1968, you had race riots in southern cities like Atlanta and Baltimore, and Columbus, Georgia, in fact. But you also had race riots in places like San Francisco and Oakland and Seattle and Cleveland and Cincinnati, Columbus, Ohio, Chicago, New York, Detroit. So these are large race riots in northern cities. So racism was not just a southern issue here in the 60s, and that's often overlooked. Now, there was another wing of the civil rights movement that was more militant, and that would be people like Malcolm X, the Black Power movement. X was part of what was called the Nation of Islam. It's still around, and they were much more ardent in their approach, their militant approach to the civil rights issue. In fact, they said they would use any means necessary to get equal rights. And so you had the Black Panthers, who were kind of a paramilitary arm of this Black Power movement. So X actually later became opposed to this stuff and was shot and killed by members of the Nation of Islam for turning on the message. The civil rights movement actually was broadcast to the world in 1968 because at the 1968 Summer Olympics, Tommy Smith and John Carlos gave the Black Power protest, the Power to the People salute, while they were receiving their medals. This was broadcast on television around the world, and so at that point people were drawing attention to the issue, and not just here in the United States, but also around the world as well. Now, Richard Nixon became president, of course, in 1969, and Nixon is often considered to be a very conservative president, but I must say that during his administration, there were two very important developments. The first is affirmative action, which is a controversial legislative agenda that some call reverse discrimination. In fact, it's illegal in California. But affirmative action was originally designed to deal with federal contracts, and so they wanted to ensure that minority companies had equal access to federal contracts and federal money. And what happened with this is that oftentimes this would stretch out to other things like higher education, so that you would have a proper, what was considered a proper racial mix in your hiring practices. Now, quotas actually are illegal, but people will still use affirmative action as a race-based qualification for a job, and try to get more minorities into jobs. And so there's two sides to this, and it's very controversial. Some support it, some don't, and this is still playing out in American politics. It's also in this period of time you'll get a federal busing mandate, which was the final desegregation of public schools. So the federal government's not only going to get involved in saying you have to integrate, but if we deem that your schools are too segregated, we can force people from one community to another, even if you have to ride a bus for 2 hours to get there when you have the school right next door and in a block within your house, or in some cases. So this was very unpopular, particularly in northern cities. There were riots in Boston over the busing mandate. But it's in the Nixon administration in the 1970s that you get the final desegregation of public schools in the United States. Now, civil rights, 1970s to the present, you have people like Jesse Jackson, the Rainbow Coalition. Jackson was one of Martin Luther King's followers, and so when King's dead, Jackson will become one of the leaders of the civil rights movement. Maynard Jackson was the first black mayor of Atlanta, and Maynard Jackson was supported by the white business community, but when he was in office, they turned their back on him because he started using affirmative action and other things to reorganize the city, and you started having tremendous white flight out of Atlanta during that time period. Boycotts are the primary tactic now for the civil rights movement. If they don't like what's going on in a particular state or area, there will be an economic boycott. But what you can say about the civil rights legislation, I have a question mark there, but I think generally Americans would consider the United States to be far less segregation, of course, is gone by law, and Americans would consider the United States to be far less interested in racist policies than at any point in American history. And so I think that the results are, there's no water cannons or dogs anymore, so the results have generally been positive, even though people would say there's still work to be done, but the results have been positive overall. Now, let's talk about the women's rights movement very briefly. So this is also considered part of civil rights, and the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, and then, of course, temperance was a major issue there. So suffrage and temperance were two of the first important issues for the feminist movement. And the two earliest feminists, the most famous earliest feminists in the United States were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And really the first wave of feminism was targeted at obtaining voting rights, and that's about it. In fact, many of these women became disenchanted with the civil rights legislation because it only addressed racial discrimination and had nothing to do with discrimination against women. So these women who had supported the Republicans in these early phases after the war were not very happy with the Republican Party when they didn't seem to be supporting their agenda. Now, by the 1950s and the 1960s, you have what's often called the second wave of feminism. And the leader of the second wave of feminism, at least early on, is Betty Friedan. She wrote a book in the 1950s entitled The Feminine Mystique, where she said that women's gender roles are actually taught, not biological. And so she went to college and then worked during World War II. This is what she said a lot of women did. They worked during World War II, then the men came home, and the women had to go back home, and they were very unhappy. Now, Friedan never had to not work. Her husband actually quit so she could continue working. She never had to wash a stitch of clothing in her life in a washing machine. She was very much the exception, but yet she was highly critical of the society that she said was not giving women the same type of privileges that men had. She helped form the National Organization of Women, and people didn't like Friedan, by the way. She was considered to be grouchy and hard to work with. Again, even her supporters have turned on her and said that she was a hypocrite in a lot of ways. In the 1970s, you get the Equal Rights Amendment, which the idea was to add an amendment to the Constitution which would have codified equal rights for women. It failed, and it's now a moot point. But there was a push to have a constitutional amendment that would have done this. And it would have prevented discrimination on the basis of sex, essentially, is what the point was. Now, another important feminist leader at this point was Gloria Steinem. She's still alive. She made a name for herself by doing a Playboy investigation. She went in the 1970s. You had what were called Playboy clubs, and the women dressed as Playboy bunnies, and they were cocktail waitresses. And so, when she did this investigation, she found shockingly that women in these particular establishments were treated like sex objects, and there was discrimination against women. I mean, my gosh, I never would have thought that at a Playboy club when that's the point of the waitresses there. So the new focus of feminism became gender roles, and allowing women to do things that were traditionally male-dominated occupations. Abortion was a major issue now in the second wave of feminism. Pro-abortion became the model of the second wave of feminism. Of course, the very famous 1973 case of Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion across the United States, which had been a state issue to that point. And again, there's still no constitutional justification for it outside of stretching the powers of the federal government. But the states for years some states had denied it, others had supported it. So now this became a federal issue. Again, constitutional versus moral, or the moral argument there on both sides, and so this is a very complex issue. And of course, marriage and career. One of the things that the second wave of feminism advocated was that women could have both marriage and kids and a career. And so now you have the growth of the latchkey kids in the 70s and 80s, kids coming home to empty homes after school. And what's interesting is actually a trend back the other way now. A lot of moms who could be out working have decided to stay home because they didn't want to have their kids be latchkey kids like they were. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had two important provisions called Title IX and Title VII. Title IX actually affects the higher education system, and it mandates that, for example, in scholarship athletes, if you have 100 male scholarship athletes, you have to have 100 female scholarship athletes. And so this is where you would see scholarships cut for football teams and other things, so women could have scholarships as well. This was highly controversial at the time, though generally it's been well accepted nowadays. Title VII deals with sexual harassment. So if you're working somewhere and you're in a career, or even sometimes if you're not, just kind of in a job that you have, you're probably going to have some type of sexual harassment training, because this is big business. People make a lot of money on these lawsuits, and companies are ruined. So if they provide sexual harassment training, they can say that the employees have had training, they're on their own essentially, but this can ruin your life, ruin your career. So pay attention to these harassment training videos and seminars and other things, because this is a major issue now in the 21st century. And the first objective of this was to prevent basically sexual assault, men who were having a very hostile work environment for their female employees, groping and other things, and now of course this deals with both men and women, so it cuts across both lines. But it's a major trend in American law, and so this is something that everyone has to be aware of nowadays. Equal Pay Act of 1963 mandated that women get the same pay as men for the same job. Some would say there's still pay inequality. There's a lot of caveats to that, though, in terms of how that actually works, if that is entirely accurate. But I mean, there still is the common phrase that women make, 3/4 of what men make for the same job, et cetera, et cetera. So there's still both sides of this issue as well. The glass ceiling. This was a phrase that was often used where women could get to the top of the company, but then could see the top of the company, but couldn't get to the top of the company. The question is, does this exist? Well, not really anymore. Women have a much larger role in government and business. You've had women as major candidates for office, in terms also Speaker of the House of Representatives. You have women as CEOs of companies now. So as more and more women are in the college environment and getting involved in the white collar industry, there are now actually more women involved and more women in college than men. This is really going to change, because women will start having power positions in companies all across the United States. Now, the last part of civil rights legislation I want to talk about is Mexico. And so there's a very long history between Mexico and the United States. As of 2010, Americans of Mexican descent constituted about 11% of the United States population. and they are possibly the most important ethnic group in modern United States politics. So this rapidly growing population is going to have an impact on American society. So if you didn't know where Mexico was, or is, it's the closest southern neighbor to the United States. It has a long, virtually uncontrolled border with the U.S., and there are many political and societal implications for this large-scale movement of people from Mexico into the United States. So the open border with Mexico facilitates immigration. Now, Mexico has long had a politically unstable government and historically weak economy, which leads a lot of Mexicans to settle in the United States. Now, what's really interesting about that is it's actually slowed down. As the American economy has slowed down, a lot of Mexicans have stopped coming into the United States because the jobs just aren't there. So when the American economy is booming, that's when Mexican immigration is higher. When it's not, fewer people come into the United States. Many of these people are given low-pay migrant jobs in construction and field work, so the Southwest becomes the primary destination for most Mexicans, places like California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. But not just that. I mean, you're starting to see large communities in places like Tennessee and other southern states. So it's not just along the Southwest anymore. Now, as of 2013, there are approximately 7 million undocumented Mexicans in the United States, making it the largest illegal immigrant group in North America. The argument against this particular problem is not legal immigration, people come to the United States legally, but illegally, because illegal immigrants are already breaking the law, and so there's a question now whether they're going to break other laws, and so that becomes a major issue. So as you can see in the map here, the Southwest, the pink areas are areas of high concentrations of people of Mexican descent. Now, in terms of modern immigration, we're going to talk about this for a second. There are more peoples from non-European countries from 1930 to present, generally Asia and Latin America, and so this is going to change the demographics of the United States and what's often called the browning of America. Now, I'll talk about that at the end in just a few slides here, so I'm not going to steal my thunder yet, but you can see that immigration starts rapidly increasing after World War II, and a lot of these people are not of European descent. And then from 61 to 2000, you can see you start getting almost 1 million people a year here legally, entering the United States legally. And most of them are of non-European descent. Now, restriction on immigration was a rather interesting history of that. In fact, a lot of people think that the United States has never really favored restriction on immigration. That's simply not true. That's been the exception, that's been the norm rather than the exception. Between 1917 and 1920, you had literacy tests. You had to be able to read English, speak English, if you wanted to come to the United States. 1920s, you had a quota system where there were only allowed people from certain countries, a certain amount of people from certain countries into the U.S. In 1952, you get the McCarran-Walter Act, which maintained quotas and screened for subversives. So what they're looking for here are communists. And then in 1965, you get the Immigration and Nationality Act, which relaxed the quota system. So now you see a general relaxation of immigration, which you can see on this last chart. If I go back to here, you can see 1965. This is why you start seeing tremendous growth in immigration numbers. And then you have 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which placed penalties on employers for hiring illegal immigrants, but also gave amnesty for about 3 million illegal immigrants in the United States. Again, immigration is going to jump tremendously in that period of time, as you can see on that bar graph I just showed you. Now, major issues with Mexican immigration, U.S. relations with Mexico. So you have NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is a free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada that allowed for companies to have no tariffs when they're sending products into the United States from Mexico. And so almost immediately what happened, you had American companies go and set up shop in Mexico because there are no environmental or labor laws there really. So they could make more money because their wage earners were much lower in terms of the amount of money they paid them. So you have low-wage workers, undocumented workers. This does cause problems for people who are in the United States who want these jobs. Though in some cases, Americans don't want these jobs. So these people are working jobs that Americans won't work. Illegal immigration, though, is going to place a strain on things like education resources, health care, fire and police protection, terrorism, because there's this unsecure border. You can get drugs or other things into the United States very easily. And, of course, the political impact of our relation with Mexico, 80 to 90%, maybe even higher, of Mexican Americans vote Democrat. So that's going to have a major factor in American politics in winning elections in the future. Now, a very important Mexican American individual was a man named Cesar Chavez, who was head of the United Farm Workers. He fought for higher wages and rallied against illegal immigration. I mean, this is a lot of people here legally don't like illegal immigration because they say it cuts wages, it causes problems, it causes a negative stereotype. And so Chavez was very much in favor of cutting off illegal immigration, really trying to keep it legal, because he wanted people to make more money. All right, now, the impact of Mexico on American culture. 33 to 40 million people in the United States classify themselves as Mexican American. And I mentioned this term, browning of America. Within 20 years, if you put all minority groups together in the United States, they will outnumber white Americans. So white America, again, it'll be the largest subgroup, but when you put all groups together, it'll be in the minority. So the America is rapidly changing in terms of racial dynamics and everything else in the United States, and Mexican immigration has a lot to do with that. A lot of Mexicans, of course, are Catholic, and they speak Spanish. So there's opposition to Mexican immigration in both accounts. So, for example, people pushing for English as the official language. Mexican food is also one of the most popular ethnic foods in the United States. People love it, so this is something that people will point to as a benefit for this expanding cultural horizons in the United States. Now, questions. What does civil rights legislation accomplish? I think without a doubt you can say that the United States is far less, or at least for a time, was far less racist than it was in the 1950s and 60s. Does discrimination still exist? Absolutely. And can anyone in the United States excel regardless of race, class, or gender? Absolutely. So I think that you see some positives. So there's always going to be hiccups. Now, has segregation disappeared? I would say no. And does it matter? And is it only in the South? So it doesn't matter, not morally, but do Americans really care about segregation? I think for the most part it's no in terms of where they live. They want to live. They want to have freedom of association. They want to live with people that like them. And so that does create segregation. You might call it separation or self-determination, but it does produce that. And it's not just the South. In fact, the most segregated places of the United States are often in the North, in northern cities. So this is a 1990 map, but you can see segregation is very strong in northern cities. You have it in the South as well, but your highest levels of segregation are in the Northeast and the Midwest. All right, so that's it for this particular presentation. I will see you for presentation 20, and